It's still 2022, and today I'm going to tell you why every American should be able to vote. But actually though. In Part 0 we went over the basic logical reason for absolute universal suffrage, with the goal of convincing you that suffrage should be considered as a purpose default, a default that we should be wary of deviating from. In other words, we should first ask, why not why, when considering whether a group should be able to vote. Today we will go through some of the groups in question, roughly in order of increasing time at which I talk about them. Along the way we will uncover the reasons we may have for not letting them vote, and discuss the supplementary reasons we may have to comfort ourselves in ultimately letting them. This will be a more concrete approach, but we are not substantially abandoning the theory from Part 0, only adding some new growth of nuance to it, creating a shrub, if you will. This time around, I actually expect you to agree with me that most everyone should be able to vote. In fact, I believe you probably already do, you just don't know it yet. As such, and for the sake of transparency, I will concede that this video may not be as out there as you may expect. With that, let's get started. First, let's talk about one of the most controversially excluded groups from American democracy, a group so vindictively and needlessly marginalized that I'm genuinely shocked we have allowed their exclusion to persist into the modern era. I'm talking, of course, of politicians. We all know that people in the District of Columbia should be able to vote. That's why we made a whole amendment allowing them to vote for the president. There are reasons why DC doesn't have voting representation in Congress, but they're essentially pearl-clutching about the sanctity of round numbers at best, and cynical partisan power plays at worst. Many others have articulated the rather obvious reasons why DC should be able to vote, but the one thing I will add is DC doesn't have to be a state. We can totally just let them vote with Maryland. Based on the rhetoric, a lot fewer people would have an issue with that. Similar to DC are America's territories, which don't really get to vote at all on a national level. The controversy here is pretty much the same as with DC, but the racism is a bit more tropical this time around. As such, this is another pretty obvious let them vote case. Again, we don't need to give Midway a total statehood to give these people suffrage. May I suggest some of the least populated states pair up with a territory each to even things out in the Senate, or we could just group them all with Hawaii because islands. DC and the territories pretty obviously deserve the vote, but perhaps the most mainstream area for suffrage expansion lies in former felons. In a number of states like Virginia and Florida, people who have served their time are permanently unable to vote. Again, this is a pretty obviously harmful and pointless exclusion, so I won't say too much more about it. More interesting, but still well within the Overton window, is the idea of letting the actively incarcerated vote. A couple states do actually allow them to vote, and I hope we can agree there is no need for voting rights to contract in this country. What makes the issue of voting rights for prisoners interesting is that it raises perhaps the strongest theoretical challenge to our core reason for universal suffrage, even though it is far from the most controversial extension we will cover. This is because felons, or most of them at least, lost their voting rights by violating laws that they theoretically had a democratic role in enacting or upholding. Can the right to vote be taken away as part of a punishment? While I don't think it's great policy, it doesn't definitively violate our fundamental theory, since it can be consistent with a democratically originated morality. Ultimately, though, I would argue that the connection between democracy and law needs to be live to avoid basing moral decisions off of unvoted assumptions, so removing suffrage for a crime isn't truly consistent with our core theory. But we still haven't addressed why prisoners are banned from voting. They are ostensibly bad people who have proved themselves undeserving of participation in society, including in its moral decision-making. The obvious response is that many felons are, in fact, not irredeemable monsters whose moral views are incompatible with polite society. I don't exactly have the numbers on this, but I'd wager that a significant percentage of criminals do recognize that the crimes they were convicted of should be illegal, even if they don't think that they personally did anything egregious. But I think that even those who would vote to legalize whatever crime they committed should still be able to vote. We can defend this commitment to the principle with one of the most helpful justifications for expanding suffrage. It won't make a difference, and if it does, it probably should. There simply aren't enough incarcerated murderers to outnumber the anti-murder voting bloc. And if allowing criminals to vote did end up tipping the scale on an issue that is fairly controversial, say substance legality or abortion, I would argue that is absolutely a good thing. After all, when we are collectively unsure of whether a practice warrants imprisonment, the views of those who see the consequences of that decision are particularly relevant. Next, we will talk about the other major group that is legally obligated to spend time in government or approved private facilities for the purported purpose of making them acceptable members of society. Children. This is the big one. You probably wouldn't say that children should be able to vote. At least not all of them. But you don't really think kids should be barred from voting. You think kids are stupid. And I'm not saying they're not, but I am saying that making non-stupid a condition for voting rights would exclude a whole lot of people over 17. There are probably more reasons that you would give for why kids shouldn't be able to vote. I've collected some of these reasons, so let's run through them and I will provide my responses. First, they are biologically less capable. They are too emotional and hormonal, and would accordingly vote based on appearance or other superficial reasons instead of soberly and rationally making decisions, like the rest of us do. This argument is pretty clearly flawed. Policy is, and has been, a rather small part of politics for most people. Few voters are breaking out the notepad and calculator before choosing red or blue. Second, they lack the knowledge and expertise to make informed decisions. Again, not too convincing. Americans are famously uninformed about civics, and regardless of who you ask, about a third of the country is helplessly misinformed. Third, their interests are already accounted for by their households and society at large. I'm not sure if the premise is really true, but even if it is, letting them vote wouldn't represent their interests any worse. Fourth, they are obedient, so their votes would essentially be controlled by their families. Again, the premise is a bit suspect, but everybody is influenced by those around them and how they vote, especially their families. This is not necessarily a bad thing. It's society. Fifth, most don't want the vote, and few would use it. Well, some do, and many would. Furthermore, if we had low turnout as a basis for group disenfranchisement, the poor, Hispanics, and Arkansas would be among those barred from voting. Sixth, they already have access to political power through activism and the power they wield over those who can vote. Yes, young people have been involved in a lot of activism, and they always wave around a child or two at the State of the Union. These actions don't always translate to results. You shouldn't have to work only to have a chance at your voice counting. Seventh, there are more important issues facing them that granting suffrage wouldn't solve. Sure, letting kids vote probably wouldn't end climate change or school shootings or Brussels sprouts, but it wouldn't hurt. And if the argument here is that votes don't matter, what's the harm in letting more people vote? Eighth, they would just double or cancel out the preferences of their families. Yes, that is, in fact, the point of democracy. Ninth, they don't work, contribute to the economy, or pay taxes. Many do. Many voting adults don't. I don't think we want this to matter. 10th, they don't fight in war. Though this may seem like a similarly absurd point, no one has been involuntarily conscripted in half a century, participation in war was actually the primary argument in the 70s for lowering the voting age from 21 to 18 with the 26th Amendment. Let's not let the precedent of past progress prevent present progression. 11th, politics would ruin their innocence. I could see this one garnering some sympathy, but sheltering children is a futile endeavor in this day and age. We can definitely regulate political messaging to children to prevent things from getting too out of hand. 12th, the Bible says they are flawed. I disagree. To quote Romans 2:33, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." 13th, they belong in the home, not voting. I mean, I guess kids should focus on learning, having fun, and developing themselves as people, but voting really doesn't take too much time. It could even be a learning experience. 14th, political equality would make them lose the exalted status that gives them protection. Is this a threat? It sounds like a threat. Surely parents wouldn't stop caring for their kids if they could vote. 15th, letting them vote is a slippery slope. It'd be precedent for letting all classes and races vote as well. Granted, this video is ultimately going in that direction, but let's consider each issue on its own merits for now. No need to conflate kids and spiders quite yet. 16th, they would stop marrying, having children, and the human race would die out. Not quite sure what this one is getting at. We can come back to this. 17th, the excitement of voting would harm their babies when they are pregnant. What the... Oh. Huh. This is a bit embarrassing. Some of the sources from the 1912 edition of this video seem to have gotten mixed in with my notes. Moving on. Of course, the argument here is not that kids uniquely have all these supposedly disqualifying qualities. It is that age correlates rather strongly with them. Therefore, there needs to be an age cutoff somewhere. So why 18? The general reasoning is that 18 is the age of majority, or the cutoff for a number of legal rights and responsibilities. But is it? Yeah, 18 is the number for a lot of things, but there is a lot of variation in age cutoffs for many rights, especially between the states, not to mention the huge number of exceptions. Most 18-year-olds have recently graduated high school, but that, thankfully, is not required to vote. So a voting age of 18 does not seem much less irrational than a voting age of 21, but few would advocate going in that direction. And for good reason. When we prevent a deserving person from voting, that matters. There are plenty of 17-year-olds who are just as entitled to the vote as your average 18-year-olds. Sure, they'll get the vote eventually, but elections don't happen all the time. Missing eligibility for an election by a few months can have direct consequences for several years, and indirect consequences for far longer. So why don't we let 17-year-olds vote? And while we're at it, why not the 16-year-olds? 15? 14? At some point you stop agreeing. But why? Sure, there are probably fewer deserving 12-year-olds than 16-year-olds, but the same logic applies in going from 18 to 17 as from 14 to 13. Because we have no reason to say that any particular percentage of worthy voters ought to be the cutoff for justifying disenfranchisement, I think we ought to err on the side of our initial theory, and just not have a cutoff at all. Even though there are a lot of children, there aren't enough of them to pass anything too crazy. This isn't Uganda. But what about the age groups where no one can reasonably be considered to be reasonable? While I don't personally know any babies that I would consider capable of making significant political decisions, I do still think it is reasonable to grant them suffrage for the sake of the theory. Why do I think babies should be able to vote? Listen close, for this is perhaps the most powerful justification for universal suffrage. I think babies should be able to vote, because I don't think they are going to. No baby has the ability or will to cast a ballot, and if one somehow did, I think it's fair to say it would deserve suffrage. This idea can help quell some of the apprehension you may feel about reducing the voting age. While some 8-year-olds would vote, I expect most wouldn't, and those who do would probably be the more informed ones. On the other hand, this point is not contrary to our theory. There's nothing inherently good about higher turnout. If someone doesn't feel their voice should be counted in the societal moral tabulation, that itself is a moral claim, and we ought to respect it. This isn't Australia. Next, we'll talk about another group generally considered to be unable to make their own decisions: the mentally incapacitated. On one hand, this type of disenfranchisement is less arbitrary than age disenfranchisement, though there is some level of subjectivity in what mental illness is and what level of it warrants disenfranchisement. The people blocked from voting are all at least supposed to have the characteristics that make them unfit to vote. On the other hand, this type of disenfranchisement is much more controversial, as stripping a mentally disabled person of the right to vote is just a tad dystopian. As such, I think this is another pretty clear case for expansion. Judges don't really have the right to decide if someone is incompetent, and if they truly are, the chances of them voting are so low that any possible consequence of letting the wrong people vote is negligible. Speaking of groups associated with the color green, let's move on to the next issue: permanent residence. In theory, immigrants can't vote in most elections because they haven't yet proven their belonging in the United States. Once they have been here long enough, they can take a test to prove they deserve citizenship and the vote. I expect the latter aspect is more questionable for you. Some parts of the naturalization test, fairly detailed civics knowledge, having good moral character, loyalty to constitutional principles in the US government, knowing English, far exceed anything asked of naturally born citizens. I expect you would agree that this is pretty clearly unfair. People should not have to check all these boxes just to be able to vote in the country they live in. But I think you are still likely to support the waiting period for immigrants before they can access suffrage. After all, it would be crazy to let people vote the second they get here, right? Wrong. The same problem with making people wait to vote applies here. Sure, some people may end up leaving soon after they vote, but most would not, and we should not prevent many deserving people from voting because a few supposedly undeserving people might. But permanent residents are only half of the non-voting immigrant population in the United States. Refugees and those on student visas are in theory only here temporarily. They live here for significant amounts of time, and many will and do end up living here long term. So I think it would make sense to let them vote as well. Anyways, expecting a short time lived here isn't really the best reason for disenfranchisement. After all, no one is clamoring to disenfranchise centenarians. But the main issue here is that of undocumented immigrants, those who came into this country illegally or, more commonly, overstayed temporary visas. As you know, undocumented immigrants are contributing members of society to the extent that matters, and since we have extended suffrage to immigrants and actual criminals, I don't think it would be a stretch to let them vote as well. Speaking of crossing boundaries, let's transition to the next group, animals. As the DNC tells you before serving dinner, animals are rather similar to babies. As such, Air Bud rules should apply. We can rationalize allowing them to vote because they're not going to, and if they do, they probably should be able to. While some animals are more likely to vote than others, I don't think that we need to draw any boundaries based on species. I'm focusing here on animals for obvious reasons, but other types of life would be covered too. If corn wants to vote for higher agricultural subsidies, or the coronavirus wants to elect a Republican, I don't see why we should stop them. But there are some complications here. I'm arguing that we should let animals vote because there isn't really a risk, but is that even true? While few animals would vote by themselves, I can see that there is some possibility of game being used to game the system. With a bit of training, some animals can do remarkable things. Surely we shouldn't let any rascal with a bag of breadcrumbs and a dream direct a murder of crows into the ballot box to kill the chances of the opposition winning. While you could argue that this is conceptually indistinct from raising children with your values, you wouldn't, so I think we can just call this sort of thing voter fraud. There is also a rather unique theoretical challenge with animal suffrage. Namely, we don't enslave or eat babies. By letting animals vote, are we claiming that they have moral interests worthy of equal consideration? Do we have to give animals legal rights and become vegans? Probably not. You tell me. Keep in mind, we are not necessarily saying that animals, or any of the other groups covered here, are people, and all that implies, when we say that they should be able to vote, just that they aren't not people. Voting rights are not coterminous with human rights. One is more basic and ought to be more broad. When we let animals vote, we are giving them the chance to express their concern for their own well-being. If they decline to take it, so be it. I'm sure this sounds like evading the issue on a technicality. Yes, animals aren't going to vote, but that doesn't mean they don't have preferences. Surely they don't want to be abused, killed, and eaten. I would agree, but we don't actually know that because they can't tell us. For all we know, pigs wish for nothing more than the sweet release of death and a sweet slathering of barbecue sauce. To bring it back to the first video, if we knew or assumed what was best for people, it wouldn't make sense to be a democracy in the first place. While all this means we don't have to stop eating chicken just because they outnumber us, it doesn't mean that we have to reject the rights of animals. If enough of us, and perhaps a few apes and octopi, vote to extend rights to animals, we certainly can, but the basis of that choice wouldn't be some essential value of living beings, but rather the dominance of an opinion that values them. At this point you may be thinking about the 2015 American comedy film Ted 2. Very astute. In the film, the titular stuffed bear is deprived of his legal rights, including his right to vote, because he is a stuffed bear. Once again, I don't believe objects will vote, but should such a situation arise, I contend that we should not stop them. Speaking of things that often come from East Asia, let's talk about tourists. This is a tough one. Obviously, tourists should not be able to vote. While they are subject to our laws, they are only here for a very short period of time, and as such don't really live here. Unlike babies, it is entirely possible that large numbers of them would vote if they weren't prohibited. But earlier on, we made arguments for allowing non-citizens to vote, and against waiting periods for voting. How do we reconcile these important points with disallowing tourists from voting? After all, what is a tourist if not a potential undocumented immigrant? As such, I cautiously support letting them vote. I do think we can, and should, try to stop them, though. We can make them promise not to vote as a condition for entering the country, even if they are ultimately allowed to. While this may sound pointless, this isn't too different from how we treat undocumented immigrants in places with amnesty. Regardless, I don't think many tourists would end up voting. After all, early November isn't quite peak tourism season in most places. Yet, at least. If your disbelief is somehow still suspended, you may be thinking about the implications of letting tourists vote. Americans in foreign countries are able to vote with absentee ballots, even if they do not live here. You probably think this is very reasonable. I agree. But the problem here is that this suggests actually being in the United States need not be a precondition for voting here. If a Russian citizen calls the Secretary of State in Wisconsin and says,
"Hello, I'm going to illegally immigrate into your country in November, but my flight was delayed, so I will miss the election. Please send to me absentee ballot."
On what basis can we reject the request? Clearly, we need to. If adversarial foreign powers could easily have their people vote in American elections, they absolutely would. And there are a whole lot of people in adversarial foreign countries. Even if the potential voter is not actually going to immigrate to the US, the result of the election could very well have an impact on them. Do people not living in a country have a right to participate in its elections, especially with a powerful country like the US? In theory, perhaps. But in theory, Ja Rule is 11 and a coffee cup is a donut and all borders are illegitimate and nothing means anything. The reality is that countries exist, and elections will necessarily exist within them. This argument for universal suffrage is working within that reality, so we will respect the idea of nation in disallowing foreigners from voting. The result of this, and my practicable proposal, is that, as a sovereign nation, the United States is allowed to prevent foreigners from entering the country, and even to remove them once they are here. However, if someone manages to sneak past the line and physically get in the United States, they cannot be turned away from the ballot box. Now that we're solidly outside the realm of traditional thought, let's take a second look at babies. While there seems to be a natural cutoff for suffrage, birth, not everyone agrees that that is when life starts. As cutoffs are generally bad when unnecessary, I would, in fact, allow fetuses to vote for the reason that they are even less likely than babies to do so. You may think that this is a pointless extension, but it does suggest a question about extending suffrage that I've not yet addressed. Should families be able to vote on behalf of their children? In terms of letting babies vote, this is the sort of suffrage that people have earnestly proposed, and it may sound reasonable. Currently, a family of a single parent and 3 children has just as much voting power as a lone senior. This appears unfair. But I would not support surrogate voting for children for the same reason I would not support it for animals. We don't actually know what they want unless they tell us. And if they can't tell us, they can just vote themselves. Political power should not come from number of bodies, but from number of preferences. But if physicality is irrelevant, would we give people with multiple personalities multiple votes? Should people who are of 2 minds about their political beliefs get 2 ballots? Here's another case where I think we can let our better judgment overtake the suggestions of theoretical consistency. While having a singular physical body is not the defining characteristic of a being, we can't really allow anyone to have more than 1 vote. But what about nobody? Next up, ghosts. Should they be able to vote? Just under half of you would interject that ghosts do not exist. You're right, but apparently some people disagree. If a seemingly well-meaning voter comes into a polling place and says, "Here's my dead mother, who is communicating with me from the afterlife and saying she wants to vote Dr. Oz for senator," do we reject them? Obviously, yes. Why are we even talking about this? Well, this issue is not as clear-cut as it may seem. Generally, people are able to receive some assistance when voting, especially if they need a translator or have some sort of disability. I assume this is not controversial, and I wouldn't change it. But what happens when only one person is capable of communicating with a potential voter? We may be less sympathetic to someone coming in claiming to hear ghosts or their pet goldfish than someone claiming to be able to communicate with their incapacitated parent or child, but these cases are not substantially different. As such, people should not be able to vote on behalf of others if they are the only ones who can communicate with that person. Perhaps some deserving people would be excluded with this rule, but but allowing this sort of surrogate voting is simply too risky. Going from the fantasies of the past to the fantasies of the future, we shall end with what is perhaps the most challenging one yet: artificial intelligence. Should we grant robots suffrage? Apparently some people think this is an idea worth serious consideration. More people, in fact, than almost all of the other cases covered so far. Rather than AI being any more worthy of suffrage than children or the undocumented, I think this openness to suffrage is just because AI is new, so we haven't yet set a strong cultural precedent around its political personhood. The argument in favor is that sufficiently advanced AI deserve the vote because they are essentially people. They're smart and have sentience and feel things and contribute to society. But there are a number of problems with letting AI vote, beyond the absurdity of letting robots cast ballots. Most pressingly, they are made, so allowing AI to vote could let whoever produces them massively influence, and perhaps even control, the electorate. But is this worry justified? If AI are essentially people, they should have the majority, regardless of who made them. We wouldn't decry groups with higher fertility rates for raising children with their values and becoming the majority, or at least we shouldn't. But that's gotta be a false equivalency. So what theoretical justification could we have for barring AI from voting? The whole idea of universal suffrage relies on the premise that we don't know moral truths. So if we can trace why a consciousness has the morality it does, that could justify disenfranchisement. But an AI could be made to originate a morality more organically, and we probably wouldn't want to stop democracy if and when science figures out how the brain works. Ultimately, there is a significant gray area between mere machines and true advanced intelligences, and both could be made with voting capabilities. So it would be best if we could have one rule for the whole group. With all this in mind, I would cautiously oppose letting AI vote, even though I could absolutely see people wanting to let them. So there we have it. At the end of it all, we ended up where we were going, with our criteria for suffrage changing from everyone to everyone that lives here and wants to, defined as shown. With this plan, millions more Americans would be able to vote, and democracy probably wouldn't break. There's a lot more that could be said for, against, and about the case for universal suffrage, but for the sake of time, I will end by addressing the elephant in the room, something so massive that it may flatten our entire theory. She can vote too. But seriously, if the reason that we need to let everyone vote is because voting is the way we can make justified general moral claims, why can't we just vote to disenfranchise some people? Of course, I don't mean having a referendum to confirm the status quo, that wouldn't work with our theory, but what is stopping us from having a little section of checkboxes at the top of every ballot asking, should we count the votes of the children, babies, prisoners, animals, immigrants, etc.? Honestly, nothing. Is this a loophole? Yes. Would it work? Yes. Does it make me sad? Also yes. Does it make universal suffrage pointless? Not really. Could we simply vote to keep the status quo? Absolutely. But I'm not sure we would. And I don't mean only the obvious changes like DC or former felons would stay. I genuinely believe many of the groups we have covered today would retain their suffrage if disenfranchisement were, accurately, framed as removing an existing entitlement rather than declining to extend a privilege. Here's why. First of all, people may find it expedient to allow the suffrage of some groups, knowing their interests are aligned. Furthermore, the majority always has the ability to prevent a despised minority from having its voice count. But they don't take that opportunity, at least not directly, so I could see many people checking their biases in the spirit of democracy. One of the most significant consequences of voting rights has always been a cultural shift in the treatment of the recently enfranchised group. While many people keep their biases against the group, political equality is an important factor in broader equality. When our government and society prevent people from voting, that clearly states that the excluded are of less value as moral agents, of less value as people, even. That claim matters. I doubt past disenfranchisement would have lasted nearly as long, or at all, if suffrage had to be taken away actively and repeatedly. Now, I'm not saying that all the groups we have discussed here are or should be considered as equal persons. If we are right to reject or diminish the personhood of a group, we shouldn't be afraid to. But we should take care that we're doing it correctly. Universal suffrage doesn't argue that all are worth equal consideration, but it does force us to make those decisions consciously and for ourselves. That just might mean we'll make them better.